Aristophanes, 446 BC to 386 BC, stands at the center of what modern readers mean when they talk about old comedy, not because he was only comedic poet of his age, but because he is the only one whose work survives in enough volume and completeness to function as a full archive of the genre's ambitions, techniques, and social reach. In an Athenian culture, where drama was both a civic institution and a mass spectacle, Aristophanes wrote for competitive festivals, for juried prizes, for volatile crowds, and for a city-state whose politics were lived as public performance. The result is a body of work that is simultaneously literary, including literature, theatre technology, social commentary, and historical evidence, flamboyantly imaginative plots anchored in the middle realities of war, demagoguery, intellectual fashion, class resentment, and frictions of democratic life. The basic facts frame the stakes. Aristophanes was an Athenian citizen from the deme of Caeda Athenian and worked across the late 5th and early 14th century, from the late 5th and early 4th century BC, spanning the Peloponnesian War to oligarchic disruption and democratic restorations. This was not a stable environment. It was a long crisis of imperial ambition, military exhaustion, factional struggle, and cultural reinvention. Comedy in such a world was not a private art. It was performed in front of large audiences at religious festivals embedded in the city's calendar, funded through civic mechanisms, judged through controlled selection procedures meant to limit bias, and watched by citizens who were also jurors, soldiers, office holders, and voters. The stage was one of the few places where public speech could be made too much on purpose, where exaggeration, obscenity, and explicit naming of targets were tolerated precisely because comedy framed them as play. Aristophanes' notoriety and importance came from how directly his plays collide with public life. He repeatedly puts real figures into his comic universe, turning policy disputes and cultural anxieties into ridicule. Cleon, a prominent populist politician, becomes a recurring symbol of manipulation, profiteering, and aggressive demagoguery. demagoguery. Euripides becomes a foil for debates about style, taste, and the moral function of art. Socrates becomes a caricature of intellectual subversion suspended between comic tradition of lampooning philosophers and the later more moral seriousness with which Plato and others remember Socrates' execution. These choices show how old comedy treated the polis as a cast of characters. Political conflict became theatre because theatre had become one of the polis's own tool for narrative building. Yet Aristophanes is not ridiculed to a single ideology, and that is where many simplistic readings fail. The surface signals only resemble conservatism, suspicion towards intellectual novelty, nostalgia for early civic virtue, mockery of sophistic rhetoric, and portrayals of reformers as corrosive. But these signals coexist with scathing attacks on war profiteers, contempt, contempt for opportunists who weaponize the crowd, and repeated insistence that the city's suffering is not inevitable but manufactured by self-interest actors. The plays oscillate between admiration for the achievement of an older generation and disgust at the present incentives. The combination is not coherent party platform, it is a satirist operating position inside a competitive environment marked that topically rewards topical aggression and moral posturing at the same time. Understanding Aristophanes require understanding the production system that shaped what he wrote. The great festivals were not casual open mic nights. They were large-scale productions with costumes, music, dance, choreography, trained choruses, and strict scheduling alongside tragedies and satire plays. Funding relied heavily on wealthy citizens appointed as choregoi, who financed the chorus and treated it both as civil and prestige display. That dependence matters because it tethers the art of elite resources Even when the art attacks elites, it encourages ambiguity. Comedy can appear to champion the people while simultaneously flattering the taste and anxiety of those underwriting the spectacle. When Aristophanes makes the chorus speak as an authorial voice, praising his originality and scolding the audience for insufficient appreciation, the speech is both an artistic manifesto and an attempt to shape the incentives of future judging. The tension helps explain why the biography of Aristophanes is so hard to pin down. Modern readers want stable beliefs and consistent personal commitments. Old comedy provides a public persona engineered for effect. The plays are the main evidence for his life, but they are also the least kind of evidence because they are performances that exploit irony, roleplay, and strategic exaggeration. Even the convention of the parabasis, when the chorus addresses the audience directly, doesn't guarantee unfiltered autobiography. It is a formal slot in the machine of comedy, and it can contain real details, invented details, calculated self mythology, or blend. The problem intensified because real plays were sometimes directed by others, meaning that apparent first-person references may point to a production team rather than a single authoritarian self. What we can say with confidence is limited. He was active early. He became influential enough to keep staggering aggressive political satire. He won prizes. His works remained worth copying long after contemporaries vanished into fragments. The craft of Aristophanes is one of the main reasons he survived. Ancient commentators valued old comedy as a model of Attic Greek, and Aristophanes is one of its best exemplars. That linguistic prestige fed the manuscript tradition that carried his plays through late antiquity and beyond. But linguistic purity is only a fraction of what he does. His language is engineered for theatrical impact. He manipulates rhythm, syntax, and surprise to make jokes land at the exact moment a line ends, to let a serious argument build just long enough to feel plausible, but then to puncture it with humiliating reversal. A distinct weapon is invented compound word, a kind of controlled linguistic monstrosity that transforms an abstract complaint into an audible object. These compounds are not decorative, they are comedic mechanisms that compress access into a single sound shock. Meter and form are central to his mechanism. Aristophanes used iambic dialogue to imitate the flow of speech while still maintaining the authority of verse. He shifts into longer tetrameter lines for debate, argument, and chorus display, creating a sense of speed and propulsion that suits conflict. He deploys lyrics for moments when comedy briefly becomes ritual, hymn, or lyric beauty, sometimes sincerely haunting, sometimes an ironic contrast that makes the next obscenity sharper. This formal control is what separates random absurdity from a comedy that carries politics, philosophy, and social critique without collapsing into incoherence. Aristophanic comedy is not chaotic, it is a disciplined system that produces the feeling of chaos. The famous absurd plots are not excuses to avoid reality, they are devices for making reality legible. Through exaggeration, old comedy is unusually tolerant of impossibility. Aristophanes can send a protagonist to Olympus on a giant dung beetle, or build a city in the sky among birds, and the point is not fantasy for its own sake. The point is to isolate a civic problem, war, corruption, the manipulation of speech, the instability of democratic judgment, and to run a logical experiment to its absurd conclusion. Once the premise is accepted, the comedy forces the audience to watch how incentives spiral. The laughter is not always gentle, it is often a demonstration of how easily public life becomes grotesque when private interests treat civil institutions as resources to be harvested. A recurring element in this structure is the resourceful hero. Astrophanic protagonists are usually independent minded, impatient with official solutions, and willing to commit imaginative fraud against the normal order of things to escape an intolerable situation. The hero is not a good citizen in a moralistic sense. He is a practical engineer of outcomes. He negotiated private peace when city cannot. He domesticates a jury addicted father by turning the house into a courtroom. He invents a new political order by founding a colony. He remakes civic arrangements by exploiting loopholes in divine or institutional authority. The hero's success dramatizes a core cosmic thesis. Systems can be hacked, and people who claim systems are sacred are usually protected by its own advantages. Even when Aristophanes appears nostalgic, his plot repeatedly glorify individuals' cunning over institutional sanctimony. These plots sit inside a recognizable dramatic architecture that repeats with variation across plays. There is a typical there is typically a prologue that lays out a crisis followed by an entrance of the chorus. Then a formal confrontation of Argon that decides which logic will govern the rest of the play, followed by episodes that test the new order through a sequence of visitors, trades, bribes, or humiliations, and the ending in an exodus of celebration that often include a symbolic marriage or feast. Within this architecture, the parabasis is a distinctive old comedy feature. The chorus breaks character and speaks outward, sometimes defending the poet, attacking rivals, scolding the audience, or delivering political commentary that doesn't strictly belong to the plot. The interruption is not a flaw. It is a genre feature that reveals how old comedy treated the audience as a participant in the performance rather than a passive observer. The parabasis also clarifies the relationship between comedy and democracy. Comedy is often described as free speech, but Aristophanes shows that freedom is never neutral. Satire doesn't float above incentives. The audience can reward or punish a play. Judges can elevate one comic poet over another. Cheragoi can make productions possible, and the city can tolerate ridicule as long as it remains inside ritual boundaries. Aristophanes often complains about being misunderstood or insufficiently rewarded, which implies that even in a culture proud of frankness, the crowd's appetite for one kind of joke can overpower the poet's desire to be taken seriously. This is not merely personal frustration, it is a portrait of how democratic attention functions. Comedy becomes an arena where prestige, interpretation, and mood competes with one another. One of the most historically charged questions surrounding Aristophanes is his relationship to Socrates and the claim, sometimes made, sometimes denied, that the clouds helped create the public atmosphere that enables Socrates' condemnation. condemnation. The strongest version of the claim treats comedy as a casual weapon. Mockery becomes a civil verdict in advance. The weaker and more plausible versions treat comedy as one contributor among many social stereotypes of the philosopher as morally corrosive. Combined with the political backlash against Socrates associated and the city's trauma after war and oligarch violence. Aristophanes' later reception shows another dimension of survival. He became useful. In later antiquity, he functioned as a source for Attic Greek and theatrical study. In the Renaissance and modern Europe, he became a quarry for adaptation and imitation, partly because his plots are structurally robust, and partly because his combination of bawdy comedy and civic critique is perpetually tempting. Adaptations do not preserve the original social context, but they testify to a transferable mechanism. Aristophanes supplies a way to stage public life as ridiculous without giving up the possibility that might carry insight. Different eras have claimed him for different politics. Conservatives reading him as an opponent of reform radicals, reading him as a critic of elite hypocrisy, because the play weaponizes laughter against whoever controls the moment. The deeper intellectual point is that Aristophanes reveals comedy as a form of political cognition. Old comedy doesn't merely react, it models, it sets premises, tracks incentive, and shows second order and third order effects in an exaggerated form. A war begins for reasons that appears noble, but the comedy shows how it becomes a marketplace for fraud. A democratic institution claims to deliver justice, but the comedy shows how it becomes addiction, ritual, and self-importance. Cultural elites claim to refine morals, but the comedy shows how refinement can function as status theater. This is why the wildness of Aristophanes is not childish. It is an analytical method distinguished as entertainment, one that uses grotesque access to expose what polite language hides. Aristophanes is therefore indispensable not only for the history of theatre but also for the study of Athens as a system. He stands at the intersection of art, institution, private ambition, and public ritual. Linguistic veracity, linguistic virtuosity and vulgarity, topical satire and durable form. His plays are crowded with noise, yet built with precision, filled with obscenity. yet structurally sophisticated, rooted in immediate events, yet strangely portable across centuries. If tragedy in Athens explored the limits of human action under faith and moral conflict, Aristophanic comedy explored the limit of civic life under incentives, vanity, and collective self deception. This is why he remains readable, not because his targets are still alive, but because the machinery he depicted, using public persuasion, opportunism, institutional theater, and the politics of attention, never stopped being real.